It was a quiet afternoon on a sunlit highway, the kind where the gentle hum of passing cars feels like a melody of everyday life. The asphalt stretched endlessly under the vibrant blue sky, broken only by the occasional sign or tumble of wildflowers along the shoulder. It was the kind of day where nothing extraordinary seemed likely to happen, until it did. A sleek black sedan cruised steadily down the road, its polished exterior gleaming under the sunlight. Behind the wheel sat Judge Olivia Harris, a distinguished figure in the legal world. Her presence exuded calm authority, her every move deliberate and composed. Olivia wasn't just any judge. She was the youngest African-American woman to hold her position in the state, a testament to years of perseverance, integrity, and unshakable resolve. Her tailored suit spoke of a professional polished for courtroom battles, yet her warm eyes revealed a human side, deeply empathetic and firmly rooted in justice. She was on her way to an important community meeting, a gathering of local leaders and activists aiming to bridge gaps between law enforcement and marginalized communities. A folder brimming with notes rested on the passenger seat, a symbol of her dedication to change. Olivia glanced at it briefly, her lips curving into a faint smile. She'd spent countless hours preparing, believing in the power of dialogue to spark progress. But just as she rounded a bend in the road, a rearview mirror caught a flash of red and blue lights. The sound of a siren pierced the air, breaking the peaceful rhythm of the day. Olivia's brow furrowed in confusion. She wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light. There was no apparent reason for her to be pulled over. Yet, the cruiser behind her persisted, its presence an unspoken command. Olivia signaled and eased her car onto the shoulder, her heartbeat quickening. As a judge, she was no stranger to law enforcement, but sitting in this vulnerable position, a civilian being stopped, felt different. There was a unique weight in moments like these, a history that lingered in the air. She reached for her wallet, her hands steady despite the subtle tension tightening her chest. The patrol car came to a stop behind her, and the driver's door opened. Out stepped Officer Daniels, a man with a stocky build and a hardened expression. His every move was deliberate, his presence as imposing as the badge pinned to his chest. Daniels had been on the force for years, and while his record showed dedication, his approach often raised eyebrows. Some called him by the book, while others whispered about his tendency to let prejudice color his actions. As he approached Olivia's car, his hand rested on the grip of his holstered weapon, not drawn, but there. It was a gesture Olivia had seen before, one that spoke louder than words. The subtle message was clear: power, authority, control. License and registration, Daniels said, his tone clipped, barely glancing at Olivia before his eyes darted around the car's interior, as if searching for something or someone. Olivia maintained her composure, her movements deliberate and calm. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" she inquired, her voice steady, carrying the quiet confidence that came from years in the courtroom. Daniels didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on her for a moment, a shadow of judgment passing over his face. "Just hand over your license and registration, ma'am," he repeated, more forcefully this time. Olivia felt the weight of the moment. She handed over the requested documents, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm Judge Harris," she said calmly, hoping her position might diffuse whatever this was before it escalated. Daniels paused, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. But then, instead of de-escalating, his demeanor shifted. "Judge, huh?" he said, his tone laced with skepticism. "I see people trying to play that card all the time. It doesn't mean anything to me." Olivia's lips tightened slightly, but she didn't break eye contact. "I'm not playing any card, officer. I just want to know why I'm being stopped." Daniels didn't answer her question. Instead, he took her license and registration and walked back to his patrol car, leaving her sitting there, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Olivia's fingers tapped the steering wheel lightly, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been in her position, feeling unseen, judged, and powerless. When Daniels returned, his expression was unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Olivia froze. Excuse me. You heard me. Step out of the vehicle. Her heart pounded now, though she refused to let it show. Officer Daniels, I've complied with your request. Unless you have a clear reason for asking me to step out, I'm not sure. Step out of the vehicle, he interrupted, his voice rising slightly, his hand once again hovering near his weapon. Olivia took a slow breath. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. But before she could respond, another car approached, a second police cruiser, its lights flashing but siren off. As it came to a stop behind Daniel's car, a woman stepped out, her uniform crisp, her expression calm but firm. Lieutenant Grace Mendoza, the local precinct's community relations officer, had arrived on the scene, and her presence would change everything. What happened next would leave everyone, Officer Daniels, Judge Harris, and even Mendoza, questioning the assumptions they carried and the power of moments like this to reshape lives. Lieutenant Grace Mendoza stepped out of her cruiser with purpose. She had an air of authority that didn't rely on intimidation. Her calm demeanor commanded respect without a word. Her reputation preceded her. Mendoza was known for balancing the weight of her badge with empathy. She was the officer who walked into neighborhoods to listen, not just enforce, and who worked tirelessly to repair the strained relationship between her precinct and the communities it served. Daniels, she called out, her voice steady as she approached. Her dark eyes flicked to Olivia for a brief moment, taking in the judge's composed expression, before turning her focus back to the officer. What's going on here? Daniels straightened, caught slightly off guard by her arrival. Routine stop, he said curtly, as if dismissing any need for further explanation, but the defensiveness in his tone was impossible to miss. Mendoza tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Routine. I saw your report just before I came out. You didn't call for backup. So why am I here? Daniels hesitated, his mouth opening as if to respond, but he quickly closed it again. Olivia, still sitting in her car, watched the exchange closely. Something about Mendoza's presence felt different, less confrontational, more deliberate. It was clear she wasn't going to take anything at face value, and for the first time since the encounter began, Olivia felt the smallest flicker of hope. Lieutenant, I don't think it's necessary to. Daniels began, but Mendoza cut him off with a sharp glance. I'll decide what's necessary, she said firmly, stepping closer to Olivia's car. She crouched slightly to make eye contact with the judge. Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Mendoza. Is everything all right here? Olivia appreciated the shift in tone, but she didn't relax just yet. She nodded once, her voice measured. Lieutenant, I'm not entirely sure why I was pulled over. I've complied with Officer Daniels' requests, but I haven't been given a reason for the stop. Mendoza straightened and looked back at Daniels, her expression hardening. Daniels, what's the probable cause? Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Her car matched the description of a vehicle reported earlier. Suspicious activity. I was just following up. Olivia's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she stayed quiet, waiting to see how Mendoza would handle this explanation. The lieutenant didn't miss the judge's subtle reaction. Suspicious activity, Mendoza repeated slowly, her tone neutral but probing. What specific activity? And where's the report? Daniels hesitated again, a faint flush creeping up his neck. It came through dispatch, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Mendoza folded her arms, clearly unconvinced. I see. So, you're telling me dispatch flagged this car, and you stopped it based on that alone? Daniel's jaw tightened. Lieutenant, I was just doing my job. Mendoza let the silence hang between them for a moment, the tension palpable. Olivia watched closely, her mind racing with questions. Was this stop really as random as Daniels claimed, or was there something deeper at play? And why was Mendoza here? Her sudden arrival suggested she wasn't buying Daniel's story any more than Olivia was. The lieutenant turned back to Olivia. Judge Harris, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. If you'll give me a moment, I'd like to confirm a few details. Olivia inclined her head slightly. Thank you, Lieutenant. As Mendoza walked back to her cruiser, Daniels followed, his steps heavy. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath once they were out of earshot. "What I should have been doing from the start," Mendoza replied sharply. "Don't think I haven't noticed the pattern with your stops, Daniels. You're playing a dangerous game." Daniels' face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Mendoza countered, her voice low but cutting. "You've been warned before about profiling, and this situation smells like more of the same. If there's a legitimate reason for this stop, produce it. If not, we're done here." Daniels glared at her but said nothing, his silence more telling than any argument he might have made. Mendoza shook her head slightly, turning her attention back to her cruiser. As she pulled up the dispatch logs, her suspicions were confirmed. There was no record matching the description Daniels had given. Back at Olivia's car, the judge's phone buzzed quietly. She glanced at the screen. A text from her assistant, checking in to confirm her arrival at the community meeting. Olivia sighed softly, unsure how to respond. This delay was more than an inconvenience. It was a reminder of the challenges that even her position couldn't shield her from. Mendoza returned to the car a moment later, her expression carefully neutral. "Judge Harris, I appreciate your patience. It seems there's been a misunderstanding." Before Olivia could respond, Daniels interjected, his voice tight with frustration. "Misunderstanding? She still needs to step out of the vehicle so I can." "Enough," Mendoza snapped, her tone final. "There's no cause to detain her further." Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but Mendoza's glare silenced him. "You're done here," she said firmly. "Return to your patrol." Reluctantly, Daniels turned and walked back to his cruiser, his movements stiff with anger. Olivia watched him go, her mind swirling with a mix of relief and lingering unease. She turned to Mendoza. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I know it isn't easy." Mendoza offered a faint smile. "It's my job, Judge, and for what it's worth, I'll be filing a report on this incident. It shouldn't have happened." Olivia nodded, her gratitude genuine but tempered by the weight of the moment. "I hope your report makes a difference." As Olivia prepared to drive away, Mendoza stepped back, her gaze lingering on the departing patrol car. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not for Daniels, not for Olivia, and not for her. Something about the encounter gnawed at her, a sense that it was part of a larger story waiting to unravel. Olivia's car disappeared down the highway, the tension slowly fading into the distance. But for everyone involved, the events of that day would linger long after the flashing lights were gone. What had begun as a routine stop had become something much more. A moment that revealed cracks in the system, and in those cracks, the potential for change. And yet, the story was far from over. The next chapter would bring questions no one was prepared to answer, and truths that would shock them all. As the highway stretched behind her, Judge Olivia Harris gripped the wheel tighter than she intended. Her calm exterior was still intact, but inside, her thoughts were racing. She replayed the stop over and over, every word, every gesture. It wasn't just about Daniels or his dismissive tone. It was about what he represented. How many others had been stopped just like this? How many hadn't had the advantage of her title or her knowledge of the law to push back? The thought weighed heavily on her as the road ahead blurred into the horizon. A few miles away, Lieutenant Grace Mendoza sat at her desk, her fingers tapping absently on the keyboard as she filed the preliminary report. The encounter gnawed at her. Daniels had always been a difficult officer, stubborn, rigid, and at times reckless. But this incident felt different, more deliberate. She didn't need to spell it out to know what Olivia had likely felt during that stop. Mendoza leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, the faint hum of the precinct around her offering little comfort. She wasn't naive. She knew systemic problems didn't get solved with a single report. But something about this case made her feel like she was at a crossroads, a moment where doing nothing wasn't an option. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels was far from reflective. He parked his cruiser in the lot outside a small diner, his jaw clenched as he replayed the incident in his head. Mendoza had humiliated him out there, questioning his judgment in front of a civilian, No, not just any civilian, but someone with power. He told himself he was only doing his job, following his instincts, but a small, unwelcome voice in his head kept challenging him. Was it really about the car? Or was it something else? Daniels shook the thought away, stepping into the diner for his usual coffee. Inside, a few familiar faces greeted him with nods, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. Back at her destination, Olivia arrived at the community meeting slightly later than planned. The gathering was already in full swing, with local leaders and activists discussing strategies to improve trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Olivia slipped into the room, her presence immediately noticed. Reverend Paul Monroe, a longtime ally in the fight for justice, approached her with concern. "Olivia," he said quietly, his deep voice steady but curious. "Everything all right? You're never late." She offered a small, reassuring smile, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "I'm fine, Paul. Just a little delay on the way over." Monroe didn't press further, but his sharp intuition told him there was more to the story. Olivia took her seat, listening intently as the discussions unfolded. Still, her mind drifted back to Daniels and Mendoza. She knew this wasn't something she could just let go, but she also knew the delicate balance she had to maintain. Speaking out could spark meaningful change, but it could also make her a target. That thought lingered, unspoken, in the back of her mind. Across town, Mendoza wasn't done with her investigation. She pulled up Daniel's recent activity logs, scanning them for patterns. As she suspected, his stops seemed to disproportionately target certain groups. She wasn't surprised, but seeing the data laid bare still left a bitter taste in her mouth. She knew this wasn't just about Daniels. It was about a culture that had allowed behavior like his to thrive unchecked. But challenging that culture would require more than just her voice. It would need evidence, allies, and a whole lot of courage. Later that evening, Olivia sat in her home office, her laptop open as she typed an account of the stop, while the details were still fresh in her mind. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered how much to include. The facts were clear, but the emotions were harder to capture. How could she convey the subtle weight of Daniel's tone, the way his hand hovered too close to his weapon, or the quiet relief she felt when Mendoza intervened? Those were the things that stuck with her, not just the actions, but the intent behind them. She saved the document, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just her story, it was part of a much bigger narrative that needed to be told. The next morning, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, but for Olivia, Mendoza, and Daniels, the events of the previous day lingered like a shadow. At the courthouse, Olivia's colleagues noticed her focus was sharper than usual, her tone slightly more pointed during hearings. At the precinct, Mendoza discreetly shared her findings with a trusted superior, hoping to initiate a deeper review of Daniel's actions without setting off alarms. And at the diner, Daniels overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. A couple of regulars discussing a rumor about that judge who got stopped yesterday. Word was spreading, and not in the way he'd hoped. By midweek, the incident began to surface in whispers around the city. A few community leaders hinted at it during public forums, careful not to name names but clear enough to stir curiosity. Social media posts started to circulate, with vague references to a high-profile traffic stop that raised questions about racial bias. Olivia hadn't intended for the story to get out so quickly, but she wasn't surprised. These things had a way of finding their way to the public eye, especially in a city already grappling with similar issues. One evening, Mendoza received a call she wasn't expecting. It was Reverend Monroe, his voice calm but direct. "Lieutenant, I think we need to talk," he said. Mendoza agreed to meet him at his church, curious about what he might know. When they sat down in his modest office, Monroe didn't waste time. "I've been hearing things about that stop with Judge Harris," he began, his tone measured. "People are talking, and if we're not careful, this could become something much bigger." Mendoza leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "Bigger isn't always bad, Reverend. Sometimes it's the only way to get real change." Monroe nodded slowly. "True, but it can also backfire if it's not handled carefully. The last thing we need is for this to become another flashpoint that divides the city even more. Mendoza sighed, her frustration evident. I get that. But if we don't address these issues head-on, they'll just keep happening. Daniels isn't the only one. He's just a symptom. Monroe regarded her thoughtfully. And what about Olivia? How is she handling this? Mendoza paused, considering her answer. She's strong, but this isn't easy for her. She's got a lot to lose if she decides to speak out. Monroe leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Then maybe it's time we all step up. This can't just be her fight or yours. It has to be all of ours. As the night deepened, the city seemed to hold its breath, the tension building beneath the surface. For Olivia Mendoza and everyone else touched by the unfolding story, the stakes were clear. What came next would test their resolve, their values, and their willingness to confront the truths that lay hidden in plain sight. The days that followed were anything but quiet. What began as murmurs around the community started growing louder. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into questions. At first, it was the activists who picked up the thread, those who were used to examining power and its abuses. Then came the media, digging for details, piecing together fragments of the story. Though no official statement had been made, the speculation was enough to fan the flames. For Judge Olivia Harris, the pressure was mounting. She sat in her chambers late one evening, staring at the folder on her desk. Inside were detailed accounts from past cases she had presided over, cases that highlighted systemic issues within law enforcement. Normally, she approached such matters with the distance required of her position, but now everything felt personal. She was no longer just an observer of injustice. She had lived it. The memory of Daniel's hand resting near his weapon haunted her, not because of what had happened, but because of what could have. That thought wouldn't leave her, and she knew it never would. At the precinct, Lieutenant Mendoza faced her own storm. Daniels had grown increasingly hostile, his resentment simmering just below the surface. It wasn't just the incident that had him on edge, it was the growing scrutiny. The department was now fielding calls from journalists and community leaders demanding answers. Mendoza's superiors were wary, urging her to keep things quiet and avoid stirring the pot. But Mendoza wasn't the type to stay silent. She had seen too much during her career to ignore this moment. Every fiber of her being told her this was bigger than Daniels. In a quiet corner of the city, Reverend Paul Monroe gathered with a small group of community organizers. They sat in the modest basement of his church, their faces lit by dim overhead lights. Monroe had called a meeting to strategize, knowing they needed to act quickly before the narrative spun out of their control. He looked around the room, his voice calm but urgent. "This isn't just about what happened to Judge Harris," he began. "It's about what keeps happening. If we're going to push for change, we need to focus on the bigger picture." The group nodded, but the tension in the room was thick. One woman, a young activist named Nia, spoke up, her tone sharp. "Reverend, I respect what you're saying, but people are angry. They're tired of waiting for change. We've been patient, and where has it gotten us? Maybe it's time to push harder." Monroe met her gaze, his own calm but firm. "I hear you, Nia, but pushing harder doesn't mean losing control. We can't afford to burn bridges when what we need are solutions." The room fell into a thoughtful silence, the weight of the conversation pressing on everyone. They knew the stakes. One misstep, and their efforts could backfire, leaving the community even more fractured than before. Meanwhile, Olivia found herself at an unexpected crossroads. Late one evening, as she was preparing to leave her office, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen surprised her, Grace Mendoza. Olivia hesitated for a moment before answering. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice even. Judge Harris, Mendoza replied. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" There was a pause on the other end, and Olivia could hear the faint hum of background noise. "I thought you should know," Mendoza said carefully, "that the department is aware of the attention this incident is getting. They're conducting a review of Daniel's actions, but I'm not sure how much you can trust the process." Olivia leaned back in her chair, her grip tightening around the phone. I appreciate you telling me, Lieutenant, but what are you suggesting? Mendoza hesitated again, her tone softer this time. I'm suggesting that if you're planning to take this public, you do it under your own terms. The department will protect its own interests first. That's the reality we're dealing with. Olivia's mind raced. She had already considered going public, but hearing Mendoza confirm her suspicions made the decision feel even heavier. Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll keep that in mind. As the call ended, Olivia stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her experience. It was about using her voice to amplify the experiences of countless others who couldn't. Back at the precinct, Mendoza confronted Daniels directly. She cornered him in the locker room, her voice low but unyielding. We need to talk. Daniels didn't bother hiding his irritation. What now, Mendoza? You've already made it clear whose side you're on. This isn't about sides, Mendoza shot back. It's about accountability. You crossed a line, and you know it. Daniels scoffed, slamming his locker shut. You don't know anything. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just as stuck in the system as the rest of us. Mendoza stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Maybe, but at least I'm trying to change it. What are you doing, Daniels? Besides making it worse. The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Daniels glared at her, but for the first time, Mendoza saw something behind his bravado, a flicker of doubt, maybe even guilt. It was fleeting, but it was there. The following day, Olivia made a decision. She contacted Reverend Monroe and asked to meet with him privately. When they sat down in his office, she didn't waste time. Paul, she began, her voice steady but firm, I'm ready to speak out. But if I do this, I need to know the community will stand with me. Monroe leaned forward, his expression serious. Olivia, if you're ready to take that step, you won't be alone. But you need to understand what comes with it. They'll try to discredit you, twist the story, make you the problem instead of the system. I know, Olivia replied, her resolve unshaken. But staying silent isn't an option anymore. As word of Olivia's decision began to spread, the city braced itself for what was to come. The tension that had been building for weeks now felt like a powder keg, ready to explode. Mendoza worked behind the scenes, gathering evidence and allies, while Daniels grew increasingly isolated, his own doubts and fears eating away at him. And in the streets, the community waited, their frustrations simmering just beneath the surface. The stage was set, the players in position. All that remained was for the first spark to ignite the fire. The days leading up to Olivia's decision to go public felt like the calm before a storm. She prepared meticulously, reviewing every detail of the encounter and gathering supporting documents that pointed to a broader pattern. Mendoza had sent her an anonymous tip, a file containing Daniel's troubling record of disproportionate stops. Olivia hesitated when she first opened the email, her heart racing as she scrolled through the pages. It was worse than she'd imagined. Daniels wasn't just careless. His actions revealed a clear bias that had gone unchecked for years. If she spoke out now, this file could be the linchpin, but it also carried risks. The night before her scheduled press conference, Olivia received an unexpected visitor. Reverend Monroe had come unannounced, his expression unusually grim. She welcomed him in, offering him tea, but he waved it off. I needed to see you before tomorrow, he said, his voice low. Something's come up, and I thought you should hear it from me first. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her chest tightening. What is it, Paul? Monroe hesitated, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke. There's talk. Rumors, mostly, but they're saying Daniels might have evidence that could discredit you. The words hung heavy in the air. Olivia's stomach dropped. What kind of evidence? Nothing concrete yet, Monroe admitted. But I've heard whispers about an old case you presided over, something about a controversial ruling. If they spin it the right way, they could use it to undermine your credibility. Olivia felt a surge of anger rise within her. She had always known this fight would come with personal attacks, but hearing it spelled out was infuriating. "They're digging up dirt to distract from the real issue," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "This isn't about me. It's about systemic injustice." Monroe nodded. "I know, but you need to be ready. They'll do everything they can to shift the narrative." As Monroe left, Olivia sat alone in the quiet of her living room. The file from Mendoza stared at her from her desk, a silent reminder of what was at stake. She knew the road ahead would be brutal, but the alternative, silence, felt even worse. Still, the thought of her past being dragged into the public eye left her uneasy. The following morning, the press conference was packed. Journalists, community leaders, activists, and even a handful of curious onlookers filled the space. Olivia took the podium, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. She began to speak, recounting the encounter with Daniels and emphasizing the broader implications. She highlighted the patterns revealed in the data Mendoza had shared, careful to balance her personal experience with the systemic issues at hand. Just as she finished, a reporter stood up, holding a printed sheet of paper. "Judge Harris," he called out, his tone sharp, "can you comment on your ruling in the Simmons case 3 years ago? Some critics are saying it shows a pattern of bias in your courtroom." The room went silent. Olivia froze for a moment, the name hitting her like a freight train. The Simmons case had been one of the most contentious rulings of her career. She had ruled in favor of a black defendant in a high-profile lawsuit against a wealthy corporation, a decision that had earned her both praise and backlash. She hadn't anticipated it would resurface now. She steadied herself, meeting the reporter's gaze. "The Simmons case was decided on its merits," she said firmly. "The evidence presented in that case supported my ruling, and I stand by it. What we're discussing today, however, is an entirely different issue, one that affects countless individuals across this city. Let's not lose sight of that." The reporter sat down, but Olivia could feel the energy in the room shift. The mention of Simmons had planted a seed of doubt, and she knew it. As she left the conference, flanked by supporters, her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. The headlines were already rolling out, some focusing on her powerful speech, others fixating on the Simmons case. The fight to control the narrative had officially begun. At the precinct, the tension reached a boiling point. Daniels, now under internal review, was growing increasingly desperate. He paced his small office, his mind racing. Mendoza's digging hadn't gone unnoticed, and he knew she was building a case against him. But what troubled him more was the growing realization that he might have pushed too far. He replayed the stop with Olivia in his mind, the look in her eyes when she stepped out of the car. It wasn't fear, it was defiance. For the first time, he wondered if he had underestimated her. That night, Mendoza received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was muffled, but the message was clear. "You're getting too close. Back off, or you'll regret it." Mendoza's stomach churned, but she refused to be intimidated. She traced the call to a burner phone, but the trail went cold quickly. Still, the message was clear. Someone didn't want her uncovering the full truth. As the days passed, the city seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick and unyielding. Olivia, Mendoza, and the community prepared for the inevitable fallout, each of them navigating their own fears and uncertainties. But none of them could have anticipated what came next. Just as the pressure seemed unbearable, a leaked recording surfaced online. It was Daniels, caught on a hot mic during a routine stop weeks earlier. His words, dripping with prejudice, were damning. The recording spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the city. The revelation sent shockwaves through the precinct. Mendoza listened to the recording in disbelief, her heart pounding. It was worse than she had imagined, but it also confirmed everything she had been fighting for. Daniels was called into an emergency meeting with the department's leadership, his fate hanging by a thread. For Olivia, the recording was both a vindication and a new complication. While it strengthened her case, it also escalated the stakes. The city was now on edge, protests brewing as people demanded accountability. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The storm that had been building for weeks was finally here, and no one could predict where it would lead. The city was alive with a kind of electric tension. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, their voices echoing through the streets as chants for justice rang out. Signs bobbed in the air, each one a statement of frustration, determination, or solidarity. Olivia stood near the window of her chambers, looking out at the sea of people. She felt a swell of emotions, gratitude for their support, anger for what had brought them here, and an unshakable resolve to see this through. The leaked recording had turned the tide, but it had also intensified the stakes. This was no longer just her fight. It was a movement. Inside the precinct, Daniels was facing the fallout. The department had placed him on immediate suspension, and his fellow officers were distancing themselves. He sat in an interrogation room, staring at the table in front of him. Mendoza entered, her expression unreadable as she slid a file across to him. "This isn't just about the recording, Daniels," she said. "We've been pulling records, and it's all starting to come together. The stops, the complaints, the patterns. You've crossed too many lines." Daniels didn't respond at first. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a bitter laugh. "And what happens now? You throw me under the bus, and the department pretends like they didn't let it happen." Mendoza's jaw tightened. "Maybe you're right. Maybe the system failed a long time ago. But that doesn't excuse what you've done. People trusted you to protect and serve, and you turned that trust into fear." For the first time, Daniels looked shaken. The weight of her words seemed to pierce through his bravado, leaving him exposed. But before Mendoza could press further, a knock at the door interrupted them. An officer stepped in, his face pale. "Lieutenant, you need to see this," he said, handing her a phone. Mendoza's eyes widened as she watched the video play on the screen. Across town, Olivia was preparing to leave for a community meeting when her phone buzzed. The headline stopped her in her tracks. ***, new evidence emerges in Daniel's case. Implications for Judge Harris ***. She opened the link, her pulse quickening as she read the details. A second recording had surfaced. But this one wasn't just about Daniels. It implicated several high-ranking officers in a cover-up spanning years. But what truly caught her attention was the mention of her name. The video showed Daniels in conversation with another officer, referencing a fabricated report tied to one of Olivia's rulings years ago. It was a deliberate attempt to discredit her, crafted to derail her career and keep her from exposing systemic issues. Olivia felt her breath catch. This wasn't just about retaliation. It was a conspiracy. The system she had fought to reform was more corrupt than she had dared to imagine. The revelation spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with outrage. The public now saw the depth of the corruption they were up against. The protests grew larger, their voices demanding accountability not just for Daniels, but for the entire system. Inside the courthouse, Olivia met with her legal team and community leaders. Together, they devised a plan. This fight wasn't over, not yet. The next day, Olivia held another press conference. The room was packed, the energy palpable. She stepped to the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. What we've learned in the past 24 hours is both shocking and, unfortunately, not surprising. The actions of a few have revealed a pattern of injustice that runs deep. But this moment is not about despair. It's about hope. It's about holding people accountable and building a better future for everyone in this city. The crowd erupted into applause, but Olivia wasn't done. "I have filed a formal motion to launch an independent investigation into the practices of this department and the broader justice system. This fight is far from over, but I promise you, we will not stop until real change is made." As the press conference ended, Olivia felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, she saw a path forward, not just for herself, but for the community she served. But just as she was stepping away from the podium, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. The message was from an unknown number. ***, you think this is over, but it's just beginning? Watch your back. Asterisk, asterisk. Olivia froze, the noise of the room fading into the background. The fight she thought she was beginning to win suddenly felt far from over. The system she was up against wasn't going down without a fight, and the message was clear. There were still shadows she hadn't uncovered. But as fear threatened to creep in, Olivia straightened her shoulders. This wasn't an end, it was another beginning. And she wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever.